Hi, my name is James Leask, and I'll be reading the TRC report. My section is on Aboriginal people, Aboriginal teachers at the schools. It was originally pages 127 through 130 in the original copy of the report, but now it is pages 130 through 133. Aboriginal people also work for the schools. The Mohawk Institute hired former student Isaac Barefoot to work as a teacher in 1869. Barefoot went on to serve as acting principal and was later ordained as an Anglican minister. Another former student, Susan Hardy, obtained her teaching certificate in 1886. She was the school governess as early as 1894 and was paid $200 a year. She retired at the beginning of the 1936 to 1937 school year. A young Oneida woman, Miss Cornelius, taught at the Regina School in the early 20th century. She left the following year, lured away to a better-paying school in the United States. In the early 1930s, the Brandon School hired former student Lulu Ironstar as a teacher. These were exceptions, not the rule. As late as 1960, there were only 23 First Nations teachers working in residential schools across the country. 19 taught academic subjects, and the other 4 taught home economics and industrial arts. Stan McKay, who was educated at the Birtle and Brandon residential schools, taught in the Norway House, Manitoba school in the 1960s. Although there was much that he enjoyed about the work, he left after 2 years. In his opinion, the education he was being forced to provide was not relevant to the lives of the students, or the lives of the children. There was, for example, a heavy emphasis on English and no recognition of the role of Cree in the communities from which the students came. They were doomed to fail under the system that existed. The majority of them would certainly, and did. Verna Kirkness, who was raised on the Fisher River First Nation in Manitoba, taught at both the Birtle and Norway House schools. She did not like the atmosphere at the Birtle School where, she felt, administrators discouraged students from spending additional time with her. In her memoirs, she wrote that she wondered if they were afraid of the children would tell me things about their lives away from the classroom. It was in the 1960s that a number of Aboriginal people were promoted to the position of school principal. Ahab Spence, a former residential school student, was appointed principal of Sioux Lookout School in 1963. Under Spence's administration, the school had a staff of 23, half of whom were Aboriginal. Colin Wasakase became the principal of the Presbyterian School in Kenora in 1966. In keeping with past practice, his wife was made school matron. This trend continued into the 1970s when Aboriginal people were appointed to administrative positions at numerous residential schools, including those in Mission and Kamloops, British Columbia, Blue Quills, Alberta, Prince Albert, Duck Lake, and Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan, and Fort George, Quebec. Although the total number of schools declined rapidly from 1969 onwards, they became a significant source of Aboriginal employment, particularly in Saskatchewan, where 6 schools were operated by First Nations educational authorities. Of the 360 people working in the Saskatchewan schools in 1994, 220 were of Aboriginal ancestry, almost 2/3 of the total. Most of the Aboriginal people who were hired by the schools worked as cooks, cleaners, and handymen. In 1954, Mrs. Clare, a Cree woman who had attended the school at Lac La Range, Saskatchewan, was working at the Carcross School in the Yukon. She was described by a superintendent as a very fine person, willing worker, and everyone likes her. Can certainly get the most out of the children. At the Wabasca, Alberta School, Alphonse Alluc was seen as being a tower of strength, the principal especially of late. A tower of strength to the principal especially of late. Can do fair carpentering and is loyal to the school. Principal recommends an increase in his salary. 4 young Aboriginal women, 3 of whom were sisters, have been hired to work at the Fort George, Quebec school in 1953. A 1956 report on 3 of them said, "The Herodier girls are doing a fine job." They were not, however, being housed in the same way as non-Aboriginal staff. The report observed that it was fortunate that the native girls do not mind doubling up in cramped quarters, otherwise staff accommodation would be insufficient. A number of former Aboriginal staff members felt they helped to make an important difference in the lives of the students. Jeannie Roux went to the Edmonton School and later worked as a supervisor at the Habima School in Alberta. There she challenged staff about the way they disciplined children. Mary Chapman was a former residential school student who later worked in the kitchen of the Cooper Island School. At her prompting, the school began serving students and staff the same meals. It was her rule that, if we run out of roast, the kids run out of roast. I don't give them bologna, I take the roast from the staff and I give it to them. Vitaline L.C. Jenner, who had unhappily attended the Fort Chipewyan, Alberta residential school, worked as a girls' supervisor at Brainett Hall, the Roman Catholic residence at Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. To her surprise, she enjoyed most of the experience. She recalled being asked by one staff person what sort of game she thought the children would like to play to make them feel at home. I said, "You know, I bet they would want to be hugged, like I was in that residential school. Because you know what? They're away from their parents." Former staff and the children of former staff members have expressed the view that much of the discussion of the history of residential schools has overlooked both the positive intent with which many staff members approach their work and the positive accomplishments of the school system. Although they certainly believed the system was underfunded, they also believed that they and their parents devoted much of their lives to educating and caring for Aboriginal children. Most of the staff members did not make a career in residential schools, spending only a year or two at the school before moving on. Others stayed for many years in conditions that were often very different from what they grew up with, working for low pay and living in cramped and confined quarters with, at times, less than congenial colleagues. They spent their own time teaching, cooking, cleaning, farming, and supervising children. On their own, these can be seen as positive, not negative activities. For the most part, the school staff members were not responsible for the policies that separated children from their parents and lodged them in inadequate and underfunded facilities. In fact, many staff members spent much of their time and energy attempting to humanize a harsh and often destructive system. Along with the children's own resilience, such staff members share credit for any positive results of the schools. Thanks.